The city does not advertise itself as a fortress. At first glance, it feels surprisingly ordinary. People walk to work beneath rows of Soviet-era apartment blocks. Trams rattle through wide avenues built during another political age. Cafes fill with students discussing exams, young professionals scrolling through phones, and retirees lingering over morning conversations. Life moves at a familiar pace. Yet beneath these streets lies one of the most important strategic locations in Europe. A city that has endured invasions, occupations, revolutions, economic collapse, and now war. A city repeatedly targeted by forces far larger than itself. A city that, despite everything, refuses to break. This is Kyiv. And the reason has less to do with modern weapons than many people realize. Because long before Ukraine became the center of a 21st century conflict, Kyiv had already spent centuries becoming something else entirely. A vault. Not a vault of gold. Not a vault of oil. A vault of identity. A place where history, culture, memory, and national survival were stored, protected, and rebuilt again and again whenever destruction arrived. To understand why Kyiv continues to stand, even under extraordinary pressure, we have to look beneath the headlines. Because the story begins long before modern Ukraine existed. Long before the Soviet Union. Long before Russia. Long before Europe looked anything like it does today. More than 1,000 years ago, Kyiv sat at the center of one of Eastern Europe's most influential civilizations. The city emerged along the Dnipro River, a vast waterway connecting northern forests to the Black Sea. Traders carried furs, wax, honey, silver, and slaves through these routes. Merchant ships moved between Scandinavia, Byzantium, and the lands stretching deep into Eurasia. Geography transformed Kyiv into a crossroads. By the 10th century, Kievan Rus had become a powerful political entity whose influence extended across enormous territories. The city flourished. Churches rose above the hills overlooking the river. Markets attracted merchants from distant regions. Diplomats arrived from foreign courts. Religious leaders established institutions that would shape the cultural foundations of Eastern Slavic civilization. For many Ukrainians, Kyiv represents the birthplace of their historical statehood. For many Russians, it represents a foundational part of their own historical narrative. That overlapping legacy would eventually become one of the most contested historical questions in the region. But during its early centuries, Kyiv's significance was less about political arguments and more about survival. Control of Kyiv meant influence over trade. Influence over trade meant wealth. Wealth attracted power, and power attracted enemies. The city learned a lesson that would repeat throughout its history. Visibility brings danger. The Mongol invasion of the 13th century nearly erased Kyiv from the map. In 1240, the armies of Batu Khan arrived. The assault was devastating. Contemporary accounts described widespread destruction. Population levels collapsed. Buildings that had symbolized prosperity and influence were reduced to ruins. For many cities, such an event might have marked a permanent decline. Yet Kyiv did something it would continue doing for centuries. It adapted. Political centers shifted elsewhere for a time. New rulers arrived, trade patterns changed, economic influence fluctuated. Still, the city survived. This pattern became remarkably consistent. Lithuanian rule, Polish influence, Cossack uprisings, imperial expansion, wars between competing powers. Each era altered Kyiv's appearance and political position. Yet none fully erased its importance. Something deeper remained. A sense that the city occupied a strategic and symbolic position too valuable to abandon. Over time, Kyiv became more than a location. It became a prize. And every prize attracts competitors. By the 19th century, Kyiv had become a major city within the Russian Empire. Industrialization accelerated growth. Railways connected the city to wider markets. Factories expanded. Educational institutions developed. Population numbers increased rapidly. At the same time, another process was unfolding. National consciousness. Across Europe, populations were increasingly defining themselves through language, culture, history, and shared identity. Ukraine was no exception. Writers, historians, intellectuals, and cultural figures began preserving traditions and language that many feared could disappear under imperial systems. This was not always a straightforward movement. Identities overlapped. Political loyalties varied. Regional differences remained significant. Yet Kyiv increasingly became a center where ideas about Ukrainian identity could be discussed, challenged, and developed. The city was storing something valuable. Not in vaults beneath government buildings, but within books, universities, churches, archives, and collective memory. The importance of that cultural storage would become painfully clear during the 20th century. Few cities experienced the turbulence Kyiv endured between 1914 and 1945. Empires collapsed. Revolutions erupted. Governments changed repeatedly. Civil wars spread across the region. Control of the city shifted between competing factions. Each claimed legitimacy. Each promised stability. Most delivered uncertainty. Then came Soviet consolidation. The new political order transformed Ukraine dramatically. Industrial development expanded. Urbanization accelerated. Infrastructure improved. Yet these achievements existed alongside some of the darkest chapters in Ukrainian history. The Holodomor of 1932–33 remains one of the most painful subjects in the nation's memory. Millions died during a catastrophic famine associated with Soviet agricultural policies and political decisions. The consequences extended far beyond demographics. Entire communities were shattered. Trust was damaged. Cultural continuity suffered. The memory endured. Then the Second World War arrived. Kyiv became a battlefield once again. Nazi occupation brought immense suffering. Mass executions occurred. One of the most infamous sites was Babin Yar, where tens of thousands of Jews were murdered within days. The city experienced destruction on a staggering scale. When the war ended, Kyiv faced another reconstruction. Another attempt to rebuild. Another test of endurance. By then, survival itself had become part of the city's identity. The Soviet period, after 1945, transformed Kyiv into a major metropolitan center. Large residential districts appeared. Scientific institutions expanded. Universities grew. Factories employed hundreds of thousands. The city became one of the most important urban centers in the Soviet Union. Visitors often encountered an image of order and stability. Yet beneath that surface, deeper tensions remained. Language, identity, historical memory, political freedom. Questions that had never fully disappeared continued quietly beneath everyday life. Then came 1991. The Soviet Union collapsed. Ukraine became independent. For the first time in generations, Kyiv was not merely a regional center within a larger empire. It became the capital of a sovereign state. That transition was historic. But independence did not automatically solve every challenge. Economic crises followed. Corruption became a persistent issue. Political divisions emerged. Many citizens felt caught between competing visions of the country's future. Some looked westward toward Europe. Others favored closer integration with Russia. The debates were often intense, yet they unfolded within a framework increasingly shaped by Ukrainian statehood. Kyiv stood at the center of those debates. And over time, the city became something unexpected. A testing ground for democracy. The world witnessed this most clearly in 2004. The Orange Revolution brought hundreds of thousands of people into Kyiv streets. Election disputes triggered mass demonstrations. Public squares filled with citizens demanding transparency and accountability. What mattered was not only the political outcome. What mattered was the message. People believed the city belonged to them. Nearly a decade later, that belief would be tested again. In late 2013, demonstrations began in Independence Square. At first, the protests focused on government decisions regarding relations with Europe. Then they expanded. Questions about governance, corruption, and political direction became impossible to separate. As confrontations intensified, Kyiv transformed into a symbol. Not merely for Ukrainians. For observers around the world. The images became iconic. Barricades, crowds, flags, firelight illuminating winter nights. The events known as Euromaidan reshaped Ukrainian politics. They also deepened divisions with Russia. The consequences would soon become impossible to ignore. Because history was moving toward another turning point. One that would place Kyiv under greater pressure than at any moment since the Second World War. When Russian forces launched their full-scale invasion in February 2022, many analysts expected Kyiv to fall quickly. Military planners around the world examined maps and logistics. Some predicted the government would be forced to flee. Others anticipated prolonged urban fighting ending in occupation. The assumptions seemed understandable. Russia possessed greater military resources, greater manpower, greater equipment. Yet those calculations overlooked something difficult to measure. The city itself. Not the buildings, not the roads, the people. Years of political participation had created networks of civic organization. Volunteers mobilized rapidly. Local governments adapted. Citizens coordinated support systems. Businesses changed operations overnight. Ordinary residents assisted in ways large and small. Some prepared defenses. Some transporting supplies. Some provided information. Some simply continued working so that daily life could function. What emerged was not merely military resistance. It was societal resistance. A city acting as an interconnected system. Every institution mattered. Every neighborhood mattered. Every decision mattered. The invasion revealed something many outsiders had underestimated. Kyiv's greatest defensive asset was not hidden underground. It was embedded within the relationships connecting millions of people. And those connections had been built over decades, not weeks. There is a reason many Ukrainians describe the conflict as a struggle for existence rather than territory alone. Cities can be rebuilt. Infrastructure can be repaired. Economic losses, while painful, can eventually be recovered. Identity is different. Once lost, it can be difficult to restore. Kyiv occupies a unique place because it contains so much of Ukraine's historical memory. Its churches preserve centuries of religious tradition. Its museums document national experience. Its universities educate future generations. Its archives protect historical records. Its streets hold the stories of revolutions, occupations, victories, failures, and transformations. In that sense, Kyiv functions like a vault. Not because valuable objects are stored there, because collective memory is stored there. And collective memory can become a strategic asset. People are often willing to endure extraordinary hardship to protect something they believe defines who they are. Military analysts can measure equipment. Economists can estimate costs. Political scientists can model outcomes. But human attachment to identity remains harder to quantify. Yet it often determines how long a society can endure pressure. Today, Kyiv remains a city living with uncertainty. Air raid alerts interrupt daily routines. Infrastructure faces periodic threats. Families continue adapting to circumstances few imagined only years ago. And yet life continues. Students attend classes. Restaurants open their doors. Musicians perform. Engineers work. Children play in parks whenever conditions allow. The contrast can feel difficult to comprehend from afar. A city under threat. A city functioning. A city wounded. A city alive. Perhaps that is the deeper reason Kyiv refuses to break. Not because it is invulnerable. Not because it is immune to suffering. Not because history guarantees survival. History guarantees nothing. Kyiv endures because generation after generation has treated survival as a responsibility rather than an assumption. The city has been conquered before, damaged before, rebuilt before. Each era left scars. Each era also left lessons. And those lessons accumulated across centuries. Like treasures stored inside a vault. Invisible to outsiders. Easy to overlook. Yet invaluable when crisis arrives. Beneath the streets of Kyiv lies no secret weapon capable of changing the course of history. The real vault is something far more powerful. 1,000 years of memory. A culture repeatedly tested. A society determined to remain itself. And in moments when nations face their greatest challenges, that may be the hardest thing in the world to destroy. Yet there is another layer to Kyiv's resilience that rarely appears in military briefings or international headlines. The city is not simply surviving a war. It is attempting to preserve normal life while the war continues. Historically, that has proven extraordinarily difficult. Throughout the 20th century, cities caught in prolonged conflicts often experienced a gradual collapse of everyday routines. Schools closed, businesses disappeared, population flight accelerated, public trust weakened. Over time, war consumed everything. Kyiv's experience has been different. Not because the city has escaped hardship, but because so much effort has gone into preventing hardship from becoming the defining feature of daily existence. Walk through central Kyiv on an ordinary afternoon, and the contradictions become immediately visible. Coffee shops remain crowded. Public transportation continues operating. Office workers rush between meetings. Street musicians perform for passers-by. Then an air raid alert sounds. Conversations pause. Phones light up. People check notifications. Some continue walking. Others head toward shelters. Within minutes, reminders of war appear inside spaces that otherwise resemble any major European capital. This coexistence of normality and danger has become one of the defining characteristics of contemporary Kyiv. Psychologists sometimes describe prolonged crises as a battle over adaptation. Human beings cannot remain in a state of constant emergency forever. Eventually, the mind develops mechanisms to continue functioning. Residents learn new routines. They adjust expectations. They reorganize priorities. What initially feels impossible gradually becomes part of life. That adaptation should never be mistaken for indifference. People do not stop caring. They simply learn how to carry uncertainty while continuing to live. In Kyiv, millions have been forced to make that adjustment simultaneously. The city's infrastructure tells a similar story. Modern wars are often discussed in terms of armies, tanks, and front lines, yet infrastructure frequently determines how long societies can withstand pressure. Electricity, water systems, telecommunications, transportation networks, hospitals, supply chains. The systems people barely notice during normal times suddenly become matters of national security. Ukraine's energy network has faced repeated challenges during the conflict. Engineers, technicians, emergency crews, and utility workers have become some of the least visible but most important participants in the country's resilience. When power stations are damaged, restoration efforts begin almost immediately. When communications are disrupted, alternative systems are activated. When transportation routes become vulnerable, new logistical pathways emerge. These responses require enormous coordination. They also reveal something fundamental about modern cities. Survival depends less on individual heroism than on collective competence. The people maintaining electrical grids, repairing rail lines, operating hospitals, managing water treatment facilities, and securing digital networks rarely appear in documentaries or newspaper front pages. Yet without them, urban life becomes impossible. Kyiv's ability to function has depended on thousands of individuals performing highly technical jobs under extraordinary circumstances. In many ways, resilience is not dramatic. It is procedural. It is repetitive. It is the daily decision to keep systems running despite disruption. And Kyiv has become an example of that principle in action. The war has also accelerated changes that were already reshaping Ukrainian society before 2022. For decades after independence, questions of national identity often reflected regional differences. Language preferences varied. Historical interpretations differed. Political priorities sometimes diverged significantly between regions. Foreign observers occasionally portrayed these differences as evidence of permanent division. Reality was always more complicated. Ukraine has long contained diverse cultural experiences, regional traditions, and historical influences. The country's western regions experienced different historical trajectories than the east. Southern coastal areas developed distinct identities. Industrial centers evolved differently from agricultural communities. These differences were real. Yet wars often reshape how societies understand themselves. The invasion created a powerful shared experience that crossed regional boundaries. Citizens who may once have disagreed on political issues suddenly found themselves confronting the same fundamental questions. What does sovereignty mean? What is worth protecting? What kind of future should be built after the conflict? The answers remain subjects of debate. Democratic societies rarely produce unanimous agreement. But many observers note that a stronger sense of common national identity has emerged during the war years. Kyiv sits at the center of that transformation, not because it dictates identity to the rest of the country, because it serves as the place where many of those national conversations occur. There is also an economic dimension to Kyiv's endurance that receives less attention than battlefield developments. Before the full-scale invasion, Kyiv functioned as Ukraine's largest economic center. The city generated significant portions of the country's financial activity. Technology companies expanded rapidly. Entrepreneurship increased. International investment flowed into certain sectors. A growing startup ecosystem connected Ukrainian talent to global markets. War disrupted much of that momentum. Some businesses relocated. Others suspended operations. Investment patterns changed dramatically. Yet many industries adapted with surprising speed. Ukraine's technology sector became particularly notable. Even amid wartime conditions, software developers continued serving international clients. Digital infrastructure remained remarkably functional. Remote work capabilities created flexibility unavailable during earlier eras of conflict. The result was a form of economic continuity that previous generations could scarcely have imagined. A programmer in Kyiv could contribute to a project involving partners in London, Berlin, Singapore, or New York while living in a country at war. This does not eliminate economic hardship. Far from it. But it demonstrates how globalization and digital connectivity have altered the relationship between conflict and economic survival. The modern city is no longer dependent solely on physical proximity. Ideas, services, and information can travel even when circumstances become extraordinarily difficult. That reality has provided Kyiv with advantages unavailable to cities facing similar threats in earlier centuries. Yet perhaps the most revealing measure of Kyiv's endurance is not found in economics, infrastructure, or politics. It is found in memory. Every generation inherits stories. Some are passed through books, others through monuments, many through family conversations. Grandparents describe occupations. Parents recall independence. Children grow up hearing accounts of events they never personally witnessed. Over time, these memories accumulate. They become part of a city's character. Kyiv contains layer upon layer of historical memory. The medieval capital of Kievan Rus. The city devastated by Mongol invasion. The imperial center. The revolutionary city. The city scarred by famine. The occupied city. The Soviet city. The independent capital. The city of protest. The city of resistance. All of these versions exist simultaneously. Not physically, psychologically, culturally, historically. When residents walk through Kyiv, they move through spaces shaped by centuries of accumulated experience. That does not make the city unique. Many ancient cities possess similar depth. What makes Kyiv unusual is how frequently it has been forced to rebuild itself while preserving continuity with the past. Repeated destruction often erases identity. In Kyiv's case, destruction has repeatedly reinforced the importance of protecting it. The pattern has become part of the city's story. And stories matter. Not because they guarantee outcomes, because they influence how people respond when outcomes remain uncertain. As the war continues, questions about Ukraine's future remain open. No serious observer can predict every political development, military outcome, or economic consequence that lies ahead. History rarely follows the paths experts expect. Unexpected events alter trajectories. New realities emerge. Assumptions collapse. What can be said with confidence is that Kyiv has already changed the way many people understand resilience. Not through slogans, not through mythology, through experience. The city has demonstrated that strength is often quieter than outsiders imagine. It exists in institutions that continue functioning, in communities that continue organizing, in families that continue planning for the future, in citizens who continue participating in public life despite uncertainty. These forms of endurance rarely produce dramatic headlines, yet they are often what determine whether societies survive long crises. And perhaps that is the final lesson hidden within Kyiv's story. Cities are not defined by their skylines. They are not defined by government buildings, monuments, or military defenses. Those things matter, but they are not the foundation. The foundation is people. People who preserve knowledge. People who maintain institutions. People who remember. People who rebuild. For more than 1,000 years, Kyiv has depended on those people. Empires came and went. Borders shifted. Governments rose and fell. The city endured. Not because history protected it, because generation after generation chose not to abandon it. And that choice, repeated across centuries, may be the most valuable treasure inside Kyiv's secret vault. To fully understand why Kyiv continues to occupy such a powerful place in the Ukrainian imagination, it helps to leave the government buildings, military maps, and international summits behind for a moment. The deeper story often exists in neighborhoods far from the centers of power. In the apartment blocks where multiple generations have lived under radically different political systems. In the courtyards where children play beneath buildings that survived occupations and economic collapses. In the small churches whose congregations persisted through decades of official atheism. In the markets where conversations quietly preserve regional accents, family histories, and cultural traditions. Cities are often described through statistics. Population, GDP, infrastructure, investment. Yet statistics rarely explain attachment. People do not defend cities because of spreadsheets. They defend them because cities become containers for personal history. A grandmother's apartment, a favorite street, a university classroom, a park bench, a neighborhood bakery. The places where ordinary life unfolds gradually become inseparable from identity itself. When Kyiv faces danger, residents are not merely protecting a capital city. Many are protecting the physical landscape of their own memories. That distinction matters, because memory can be a remarkably powerful force in moments of crisis. There is another reason Kyiv occupies such a central role in Ukraine's future. It functions as a meeting point between different versions of the country. Ukraine is geographically vast by European standards. Travel from the forests of the north to the Black Sea coast, and the landscape changes dramatically. Move west toward the Carpathian Mountains, and historical influences shift again. Industrial regions in the east developed under different economic realities than agricultural communities elsewhere. These differences have produced a rich and often complicated national mosaic. Kyiv sits near the center of that mosaic. People arrive from every region. Students move there for education. Professionals relocate for work. Government institutions attract talent from across the country. The result is a city that often reflects Ukraine's diversity more clearly than any single region can. This role has become especially important during wartime. Millions of people have experienced displacement. Communities have been reshaped. Families have relocated. In many cases, Kyiv has become a place where different regional experiences intersect. A city where conversations about the future are informed by perspectives from across the nation. That process is not always smooth. No society undergoing immense pressure avoids disagreement. Yet the existence of those conversations remains significant. It suggests a society actively negotiating its future rather than passively accepting it. The international attention directed toward Kyiv since 2022 has also transformed the city's place in the global imagination. For many years, foreign perceptions of Ukraine were often limited. Some associated the country primarily with Soviet history. Others knew little beyond geography. Many could not identify Kyiv's significance beyond its status as a capital city. The war changed that dramatically. Journalists, diplomats, researchers, military analysts, humanitarian organizations, and political leaders suddenly focused on Kyiv. The city became a symbol in countless international discussions. But symbols can be misleading. They simplify realities that are often far more complex. The real Kyiv is not a symbol. It is a living city filled with contradictions. Ancient churches stand beside modern office towers. Tech entrepreneurs work within sight of Soviet architecture. Young Ukrainians envision futures connected to Europe, while older generations carry memories shaped by entirely different historical experiences. The city contains optimism and grief, ambition and uncertainty, continuity and change. Like any major capital, it is far more complicated than the narratives often constructed around it. That complexity is part of what makes Kyiv important. It resists easy categorization, and societies that resist simple explanations are often more resilient than outsiders expect. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Kyiv's story is how frequently predictions about its future have proven wrong. Over the centuries, many assumed the city had entered irreversible decline. After the Mongol invasion, after imperial upheavals, after revolutionary violence, after wartime destruction, after economic collapse, after political crises. Again and again, observers looked at the damage and concluded that recovery would be difficult or impossible. Again and again, Kyiv recovered in ways few anticipated. Recovery never meant returning to the exact past. The city changed each time. New generations arrived. New institutions emerged. New priorities replaced old ones. Yet continuity survived alongside transformation. This ability to evolve without losing identity may be one of Kyiv's most important characteristics. Some cities preserve themselves by resisting change. Kyiv has often survived by adapting to it. That adaptability has become one of its greatest strategic advantages. Not merely during war, across its entire history. As darkness falls over the city, Kyiv reveals another side of itself. The golden domes of ancient monasteries catch the last light of evening. Bridges stretch across the Dnipro, connecting neighborhoods divided by geography but united by shared experience. Traffic continues moving. Restaurants remain open. Families gather for dinner. Students prepare for exams. Life proceeds. This may seem ordinary. In reality, ordinary life is one of the most difficult things to preserve during extraordinary times. Maintaining routines requires effort. Maintaining hope requires effort. Maintaining institutions requires effort. Maintaining a future requires effort. Kyiv's story is ultimately a story about that effort. Not a single battle, not a single political movement, not a single historical event. A long accumulation of choices made by countless individuals across centuries. People who rebuilt after destruction. People who preserved culture during repression. People who maintained communities during uncertainty. People who refused to allow temporary crises to define permanent outcomes. The world often searches for dramatic explanations when examining resilient societies. Secret strategies, hidden advantages, extraordinary leaders. Sometimes those factors matter. Yet Kyiv's endurance points towards something less dramatic and perhaps more important. Resilience is rarely created in a moment. It is accumulated, year after year, generation after generation, crisis after crisis, until it becomes embedded within institutions, traditions, expectations, and collective memory. That process cannot be built overnight, and it cannot easily be destroyed. For more than 1,000 years, Kyiv has stood at the intersection of competing empires, competing ideologies, and competing visions of the future. Many sought to control it. Some sought to reshape it. Others attempted to erase parts of its identity altogether. Yet the city remains. Changed, certainly. Scarred, undeniably. But still standing. And perhaps that is the true meaning of Kyiv's secret vault. It is not buried beneath the ground. It cannot be locked behind steel doors. It cannot be seized like territory on a map. The vault exists within the accumulated memory of a people who have repeatedly faced the possibility of loss and chosen, each time, to rebuild instead. That inheritance has become one of the most valuable assets Ukraine possesses. Not because it guarantees victory. History offers no guarantees. But because it provides something equally important. The belief that survival is possible. And for a city that has spent centuries proving that point, belief itself can become a form of strength. Yet there is one final dimension to Kyiv's story that extends beyond Ukraine itself. Throughout history, certain cities have come to represent larger questions about civilization. Not because they are perfect, not because they are the largest or wealthiest, but because events unfolding within them force societies elsewhere to confront uncomfortable realities. Athens once became a stage for debates about democracy. Berlin became a symbol of ideological division during the Cold War. Sarajevo revealed how fragile peace could be in modern Europe. Kyiv now occupies a place within that tradition. The questions surrounding the city are no longer solely Ukrainian questions. They concern the nature of sovereignty in the 21st century, the limits of military power, the resilience of democratic institutions, the role of national identity in an interconnected world, the relationship between history and modern politics. These are not abstract academic discussions. They influence diplomatic decisions, military planning, economic policy, and international alliances across multiple continents. In that sense, Kyiv has become both a local reality and a global reference point. What happens there is watched far beyond Ukraine's borders. And yet, despite all the international attention, the city's future will ultimately be shaped by the people who live there. As it always has been. There is a tendency in modern media to compress history into short timelines. A few years become the entire story. A single crisis becomes the defining event. A generation becomes an era. Kyiv resists that kind of compression. Its history unfolds across centuries. The city's current chapter cannot be fully understood without acknowledging the ones that came before. The medieval merchants navigating river routes, the monks preserving manuscripts, the traders crossing frontiers, the intellectuals defending language and culture, the workers rebuilding after war, the citizens gathering in public squares demanding political change, the families adapting to uncertainty while trying to maintain ordinary lives. Each generation inherited a city shaped by previous struggles. Each generation left something behind for those who followed. The result is a chain stretching across more than 1,000 years. A chain that has survived repeated attempts to break it. This continuity is easy to overlook because it develops slowly. Unlike battles or elections, historical continuity rarely produces dramatic moments. It accumulates quietly. A preserved document, a restored building, a story passed from parent to child, a tradition maintained despite pressure to abandon it. Eventually, these small acts become something larger. They become a civilization's memory of itself. Late at night, when traffic fades and much of the city grows quiet, Kyiv reveals traces of every era that shaped it. The silhouette of ancient monasteries recalls the medieval world. Broad Soviet boulevards reflect the ambitions of a vanished superpower. Modern glass towers signal a country still defining its place in the global economy. Very few cities contain so many historical layers in such close proximity. Even fewer have experienced so many moments when those layers seemed at risk of disappearing. Yet they remain, not unchanged. Nothing in history remains unchanged, but recognizable, connected, alive. That continuity is part of why the city matters. It offers evidence that identity can survive profound disruption. Not untouched, not unscarred, but intact enough to endure. For societies confronting uncertainty, that lesson carries enormous weight. The future of Kyiv remains unwritten. No documentary narrator, historian, politician, or military strategist can confidently describe exactly what the city will look like 20 years from now. New challenges will emerge. New opportunities will appear. The political landscape will evolve. The economic landscape will evolve. Technology will reshape daily life in ways that are difficult to predict. Future generations will inherit circumstances very different from those of today. What seems permanent now may prove temporary. What appears impossible may become reality. History has a habit of surprising even the people who study it most closely. Kyiv understands that perhaps better than most cities. Its past is filled with moments that few would have predicted beforehand. Periods of decline followed by renewal. Moments of destruction followed by growth. Years of uncertainty followed by unexpected transformation. The city's history does not move in a straight line. It never has. And that may be precisely why it continues to endure. Adaptation is easier for societies that understand change is inevitable. Kyiv has spent centuries learning that lesson. In the end, the story of Kyiv is not really about a city refusing to break. Cities themselves do not possess courage. Buildings do not make decisions. Streets do not preserve memory. People do. The true story is about generations of individuals who repeatedly chose preservation over surrender, rebuilding over abandonment, and continuity over erasure. Some were famous. Most were not. Teachers, engineers, writers, workers, students, religious leaders, business owners, parents raising children during uncertain times, citizens who never expected to become part of history, yet found themselves carrying pieces of it forward. Collectively, they transformed Kyiv into something more durable than stone walls or military fortifications. They created a living archive, a place where memory survives not because it is stored in museums alone, but because it remains active in everyday life. That is why Kyiv cannot be understood merely through maps, military campaigns, or political speeches. Its most important strength is invisible. It exists in shared experiences, shared sacrifices, shared stories, and shared determination. The secret vault of Kyiv was never hidden underground. It was never protected by locks. It was never guarded by armies. It exists within the accumulated memory of a people who have spent more than 1,000 years learning how to endure. Empires discovered it. Invaders encountered it. History tested it repeatedly. And every time it seemed close to disappearing, it resurfaced once more. Different, older, wiser, but still there. As dawn breaks over the Dnipro River and sunlight touches the golden domes above the city, Kyiv stands where it has stood for centuries, between past and future, between memory and possibility, between uncertainty and determination. A city shaped by history. A city still writing history. And a city whose greatest treasure has never been what lies beneath its ground, but what endures within its people. For centuries, maps have changed around Kyiv. Kingdoms disappeared. Empires expanded and collapsed. Borders shifted. Flags were raised and lowered. Entire political systems emerged with promises of permanence, only to fade into history. Through all of it, Kyiv remained. Not untouched by events, but connected to something deeper than any single government or era. That is what makes the city so difficult to understand through military reports alone. The story of Kyiv is not simply about geopolitics. It is not only about war. It is not only about territory. At its core, it is a story about continuity. About what survives when everything else changes. The churches that still ring their bells. The archives that preserve centuries of memory. The families who pass stories from one generation to the next. The students who inherit a history they did not create, yet become responsible for carrying forward. These things rarely dominate headlines, yet they often outlast the events that do. Long after battles end and political arguments fade, societies are defined by what they choose to remember and what they refuse to forget. Kyiv has spent more than 1,000 years making that choice. Again and again. And perhaps that is the real answer to the question we began with. Why does this city refuse to break? Not because it has avoided hardship. Not because it possesses some hidden advantage. Not because history has been kind to it. In many ways, history has been remarkably harsh. Kyiv refuses to break because every generation has inherited evidence that survival is possible. Evidence written into its streets, its monuments, its neighborhoods, its collective memory. The city has fallen before. It has been occupied before. It has been damaged before. Yet each time, people returned. They rebuilt homes, reopened schools, restored churches, restarted businesses, reclaimed ordinary life. Over centuries, that pattern became part of Kyiv's identity. A quiet understanding that endurance is not a single act of defiance. It is a long series of choices made day after day, year after year. As the world continues to watch Ukraine's future unfold, the final outcome remains unknown. History is still being written. The next chapter has not yet been completed. But one fact is already clear. The strength of Kyiv was never hidden in underground bunkers, government buildings, or military installations. Its true vault has always been its people. 1,000 years of memory. 1,000 years of adaptation. 1,000 years of rebuilding. And as long as that inheritance survives, Kyiv remains far more than a city on a map. It remains a living reminder that even in the face of immense pressure, identity can endure, memory can survive, and a society can find the strength to continue. That is Kyiv's secret. And it may be the most valuable thing the city has ever protected. Fade to black. Kyiv, Ukraine, a city repeatedly tested by history and still standing.